Hello, my name is Bob, the Bookerer, and today I'm doing a special video that for once does not involve the Booker Prize. Shock horror! I'm coming to you with this sort of special video today because it is World AIDS Day. Now, World AIDS Day is really important for many, many reasons, not only because of the sheer amount of human history that is bound up within it, but also particularly this year in 2020, when we're seeing the effects that a global pandemic can have on the wider population, particularly a population who have very different health outcomes depending on many different factors, including socioeconomic status, race, geography within the world, and even geography within certain cities and towns. All of those things are having a massive impact on how well people are able to react to this crisis globally. And the same can be said as well of people living with HIV and AIDS in the world at the moment. Although we have seen a lot of medical advances that have really helped limit the amount of people who contract HIV, it's still a massive global issue. And again, the pandemic has really exposed both opportunities and challenges within that. So we've seen not only that certain people haven't been able to get the medications they need, or that, for example, research has been shifted from perhaps looking into HIV/AIDS into focusing on the current pandemic or onto sort of other medical issues. But we've also seen some potential opportunities in the sense that for many people who don't, for example, know their HIV status, having a period of imposed isolation, in terms of lockdown, in terms of social distancing, has meant that, for example, many people have been able to know their HIV status a lot better because the 3-month window that HIV can take root within allows people to have, essentially, without beating around the bush, 3 months without having had sex so they can go and get their HIV status tested. And that's a really important thing to do. And I'll leave some resources at the end about how to do that locally. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is a list of 6 books that I found incredibly interesting and informative when learning about HIV/AIDS, not only in terms of its effect on the individual, but also on its history, on its future, on its challenges, and on the very real experiences of people who have lived with HIV and AIDS. Before I begin talking about those books, I just wanted to say a quick aside about them. I'm very aware that the books I'm going to be talking about are majority written by gay men, particularly gay men in North America and Europe. And I just wanted to sort of say as a quick caveat before all of that begins, that I am very aware that is not representative of the wider picture of HIV/AIDS in the world. Obviously, gay men were particularly hard hit at certain points, particularly in the 80s, but other marginalized groups have really been affected as well. And particularly, the picture is much broader than the US, Canada, and Europe. It goes way beyond that. And I just wanted to acknowledge that before I begin, because I think that's really important. If you do know of any other really great resources or books or any other comments, please do leave them in the comments below. And I think that would be really important because this is a much wider conversation than just that. So I wanted to start with a book that's a bit of a classic when we're talking about chronicling the history of HIV and AIDS, particularly in North America and Europe, although it does touch on other parts of the world as well. And that is And the Band Played On by Randy Shilts. Now, this is a series of news articles, of conversations around scientists who were looking into the virus at the time, of politicians mishandling the virus, and the kind of public health warnings that came from many, many people. And it's a really heartbreaking look at just some of what was going on. As you can see, it's quite a thick book. I've not actually finished it. I'm about 100 or so pages away from the end. But it's incredibly important with a book like this to really go into some of the details of what individual groups were facing at the time. So, as I mentioned, for a while, HIV and AIDS was referred to as gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID, which is shocking in modern day terms, and was shocking then, but for many people, they thought it was only a gay male disease. There was also a lot of stigma directed at the people who they believed to be the people being super spreaders, bringing HIV into America, into many other places. And those were often referred to as the H's. So that included, for example, haemophiliacs who were kind of receiving blood transfusions and would sometimes, as a result, receive blood that had HIV positive blood. There would be Haitians who were seen as being poor drug users, violent sex criminals, all of these kinds of horrific things. And they were seen very much as bringing the disease to the States, which again is incredibly unfair and is barbaric in many ways. And many Haitian people faced a lot of discrimination as a result of that. As well, you know, bringing in factors of race around that, I think is really important to say. So that's a really shocking look at what was happening around that time. Other H's, for example, I believe included heroin addicts not a great word, but hookers. It was very much seen as these were the and homosexuals obviously being one of those H's. But these were seen as some of the H's who are bringing this disease in, were kind of already people who are marginalized in society in some form or another, but were being pushed even further to the margins by really toxic rhetoric around HIV and AIDS. And I think what's really powerful about this book is often exploring them through different narratives. So although this is a work of non-fiction, it feels at times like you're reading a novel or a series of short stories, because you'll have a through line of a character who you know, very early on was very skeptical about something to do with HIV and AIDS, and either ends up later changing their mind or contracts the virus. And it also, as a result, is even more heartbreaking, because instead of it just being the number, the statistic of how many people died, or how horrific it was when Nixon refused to say the word, refused to acknowledge it for the public health crisis that it was, and the kind of humanitarian crisis that it was. There was such little, in terms of resources or in terms of attention paid to HIV/AIDS at the time, that many people just died without any support, and that's horrific. And I think what Randy Shilts does very well in this book is to really go into how it felt for people in that time. That's, you know, something that all happened before I was even born, for the most part. And I think it's really important to see that these things are still crucial questions now about who gets access to medicine, what are our priorities when it comes to public health, who are the people who are most marginalized in our society, and how are we really helping them? How are we really making sure that they get what they need? A really interesting and really important follow-up to And the Band Played On by Randy Shilts is an amazing book called How to Survive a Plague by David France. Now, I've not got a copy of it here, but in many ways it redresses some of the criticisms that were leveled at And the Band Played On, which is, for example, it seemed to demonize a couple of the characters in the crisis itself, in a way that was sort of later found out to be somewhat unfair. So there was a Quebecois flight attendant called Gaetan Dugas, who is sort of seen as being one of the first patients, and one of the first people to contract HIV and AIDS, particularly in North America. And in And the Band Played On, he's somewhat criticized and sort of seen as patient zero and as this super spreader who's really arrogant. And it was sort of later found, and David France talks about this, that actually that was quite an unfair portrayal. It was only really because Randy Shilts was forced to by a publisher that kind of part stayed in. Similarly, Larry Kramer, who was a writer, playwright, and activist at the time, is criticized quite a lot for being seen as this really overbearing, horrible figure at times. And David France does some work to kind of balance that portrayal out, because actually it was a lot more nuanced. Larry Kramer was concerned and terrified that his community around him was dying and that nobody seemed to be taking it seriously. And he did not go in for light diplomacy with this. He would straight up tell people to their face that what they were doing was irresponsible and deadly. And it was a really interesting time as well related to that. And David France goes into a lot of detail around this, that many gay men, particularly at the time, had just seen this wave of sort of sexual liberation, where for the first time there were these gay bars and clubs and saunas and cruising areas that all felt like they belonged to gay men. at the time, and there was a real ownership of their sexuality. There was a celebration of their sexuality, and suddenly with HIV/AIDS, there seemed to be a kind of a narrative that their sexual practices were ones that were causing the spread of this, and that they were irresponsible, and that they were dirty and wrong, and that even disgustingly that they deserved it, which is a horrible, horrible thing to say. So David France goes into a lot of the narrative around that, how when some saunas were forced to close, and Randy Shilts talks about this as well, there was a lot of uproar with sauna owners saying, hey, look, you know, how do we know that this virus is being spread sexually? And for a long time, it was assumed it was just spread through poppers and through other like party drugs or what have you. And so it's really interesting to see that actually the narrative around it really changed with the level of understanding. As we are in 2020, we can see how there are some parallels here. Early into the pandemic around coronavirus, there were a lot of questions unanswered, and that led to people, you know, acting in certain ways in kind of human nature. They thought, you know what, it's no big deal, this is just like a regular flu. And then we saw later how much that cost people. So I think it's really important to kind of learn lessons from people like David France, who sadly lost a lover during the AIDS crisis. And he spoke a lot about the importance of the LGBTQ community coming together post-crisis and during the crisis to really find a future outcome that worked for everybody. And he has the benefit in many ways, because he is writing a little bit later than Randy Shilts was, of being able to talk about the amazing breakthroughs that we've seen happening in recent years around HIV medication. So the sheer fact that we now have antiretroviral medicine that means that a person living with HIV can live a happy, healthy, normal life in many ways, can be on medication that stops them from transmitting HIV, even if they don't use condoms or don't use any other form of safer sexual health practice. These are amazing breakthroughs. These are things that were unthinkable in the early days of the AIDS crisis, where people were dying left, right, and center, and nobody knew what was happening. It was an absolutely terrifying time, particularly for a community in the LGBT community that had just sort of seen its doors opening and had just sort of seen public acceptance starting to creep in, and was now seeing everybody view them as disease-ridden and sort of scum of society, bringing this this disease to the respectable other citizens of the US or of Europe. So it's amazing to see how far things have come, but it's also heartbreaking reading David France to see just how long it took for some of those things to happen, and the fact that we're still fighting a lot of that stigma now. You know, PEP and PrEP are two amazing recent inventions of sort of breakthroughs of medicine that also prevent HIV from being passed on through sex. Those things are unthinkable from way back when. So it's really amazing to see these works celebrate the history and resilience of a lot of people making it through those times. Next up is a book that I can't find in my house somehow, but is Derek Jarman's At Your Own Risk. Now, Derek Jarman was a figure who I only really learned about fairly recently, but I always kind of known the name. He was quite controversial sort of 80s and 90s as this painter, artist, filmmaker, writer, many, many things. And he was sort of famously disliked by members of the establishment, essentially, for basically sticking two fingers up to them. For example, he got into many, many fights with public LGBT organizations because he felt that they were being too assimilationist with their view of queer people and the LGBT community. And he really rallied against a lot of things that took place with them. At Your Own Risk is a really heartbreaking and powerful account of Derek Jarman and his life living with HIV, and how that really shaped a lot of the world around him. He, towards the end of his life, grew very, very sick. And he kept a series of diaries, which I also really highly recommend. They're just beautiful and powerful. I mean, he spends all this time around this garden in the middle of this almost wasteland. It's in Dungeness in England. and it's an area that is incredibly barren in many ways, and it's near a nuclear plant. And he built this little garden in amongst it all and really cared for them and was trying to sort of bring life into a period where he felt that he was sort of at his weakest. And it's incredible. But At Your Own Risk, I absolutely love how unapologetic he is in so many parts of his identity. Despite living with HIV and growing sort of sicker at the time, particularly in a time where the level of public outrage and disgust in many ways for LGBT people, particularly gay men, when it came to their sexuality and HIV and AIDS, it was incredibly high. And Derek Jarman did not really seem to care about that. He still spoke about owning his sexuality. He still went out cruising. He still was very sexual and really wanted that to be known. He was obviously very careful, he didn't endanger other people, but I think it's incredibly powerful to have someone be so unapologetic about who they are and about their identity in a time where gay men, in many ways, were taught shame. That was the kind of the overriding fear and the overriding feeling of the time, was that gay men should be feeling the sense of shame about their sexuality, because look at the disease that they had brought to the world, which is horrifying, and it's affected a lot of LGBTQ people for many years since. So to see something like Derek Jarman's At Your Own Risk is just such a bold and powerful move at that time. Another non-fiction work from the time that I found incredibly powerful and incredibly moving was PWA by Oscar Moore. So Oscar Moore was a writer, and he had a column in the Guardian newspaper, which is also called PWA, which was the acronym at the time for Person with AIDS. He was really brave and bold in documenting his sort of final years, as he really struggled with his health, with his mental health, and with his just sort of general ability to keep going, as he saw friends and family either step away from him or be unsure about how to deal with this sort of unspeakable pain at the time. And it's a really powerful look at his life. What's really beautiful, I think, about it is that he's incredibly warm and humorous all the way through. It's in many ways a story of him not wanting to give in to death, and him wanting to survive and wanting to keep entertaining, to keep speaking about what is happening to him. Incredibly powerful. I found it just by coincidence once in a charity shop and just thought, go for it, why not? And I'm very, very glad I did. It's a short read, but a really beautiful and powerful one, and it really does make you sit back and think, just because of how difficult this would have been for him at the time, and sort of documenting around the sort of early 90s, when still not that much was known about HIV and AIDS, despite many years of the virus having existed, but still at the time really being able to find a way of living. I think what's also really powerful about this is the sheer desperation that he found in terms of any potential remedy or anything that could soothe some of the pain or some of the symptoms of AIDS at the time. So in David France's How to Survive the Plague, this comes up a lot as well, where there were people who, the second they heard that, for example, there was a breakthrough in medicine in France, would all try to book a plane over to France, try and get access to this medicine that would do something to help. One that really sticks in my mind was there was some kind of belief that there was almost like a type of butter, essentially, that would help, because the butter would not only provide fat and help them survive, because actually what often happened to many people dying at the time of AIDS was that they would lose a lot of weight very, very quickly. And so partly it was about kind of giving them the fat to kind of sustain themselves to survive, which seems kind of unthinkable in many ways as well. But it was also believed that there was something in this butter, scientifically made, that would break down the fatty covering of the HIV virus, and as a result would mean that it sort of was flushed from the system. If that sounds a bit fanciful, it's probably because it almost seemed so at the time, and a few people you know, tried it, sort of seemed to see some results, and then got very, very sick not long after. And it, I think, speaks to just how stressful, how desperate these times were for many people, that they would be willing to just do anything, because in their mind they were a dead man or dead woman walking. And so why not just try whatever you can to find some form of survival to eke out another couple of years of life. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. But yes, PWA by Oscar Moore, I think, is really worth reading, just to see that perspective and someone really trying to survive and find joy in life despite what was, you know, increasingly a tough condition to be living with. And my final non-fiction book is a book I haven't read for a while, so I'm not sure if it will necessarily stand up to the same criticism, but it is a book called AIDS Sutra, which is a look at untold stories from India. So it gathered a lot of famous Indian authors to talk about HIV and AIDS in India. Now, this is really important with what I was saying earlier about access to medicine and to healthcare, because actually, you know, whereas the life expectancy for someone living with HIV in Europe, in North America, for example, might be roughly equal to somebody without HIV, this is not the case everywhere. And particularly the interconnections between, for example, poverty and class and access and education and your likelihood of surviving or of dealing well with HIV, or even of contracting it in the first place. These are quite complex areas, and these authors in this book do a lot of research and a lot of talking about the problem of HIV and AIDS in India, and particularly how it is spread because of lack of access. So if, for example, you don't have access to healthcare that might allow you to detect it early, or to the sexual health information that might inform you about the risks of HIV and AIDS and of how to contract it, then perhaps, you know, that increases the risks for many, many people. This book does speak a lot about, for example, sex workers in India and how they are often left in a really tricky position because they might have no other option but to sell sex. And if the client, you know, if the choice with a client is between being paid a little bit more and being able to feed your family that night but not using a condom, for example, or using a condom, having a little bit less money, it's a tough choice for many sex workers to have to make. And particularly when you throw in to the equation that it is criminalized, and so therefore the choice for many people is, well, actually, if I don't keep this client happy, he or whoever could go and tell someone about what I'm doing. That would jeopardize me, that could make me end up in prison, that could put my life and perhaps the lives of my family members at risk. And so with all of that combined, we can see how, for example, sex workers are put in a really awkward and very difficult position when it comes to HIV and AIDS. It's interesting as a selection of authors who are involved in this, because although a lot of them are Indian authors, a lot of them are quite well-known Indian authors who, I mean, I don't know necessarily their relationship with HIV and AIDS activism or work, but for example, Salman Rushdie, Kiran Desai, Vikram Seth, these are authors who are really quite well known, and particularly when we're talking about the Booker Prize, are also authors who are well known. And so it's really interesting to me that, I mean, I think there is a question perhaps to be levied about whether some of these stories could have been told better through the eyes of people living with HIV and AIDS in India. But at the same time, I think it's a really interesting and useful first step into learning a little bit more about the picture in another country. And now to fiction. There are two pieces of fiction that really resonated with me in terms of speaking about HIV and AIDS for very different reasons. And the first of them here is The Darker Proof, Stories from a Crisis by Adam Mars-Jones and Edmund White. These are a series of short stories, alternate ones, so I think half the book is Edmund White, half of them Adam Mars-Jones. And they are just incredibly powerful and beautiful tales of people living within a system and within a time where HIV and AIDS was so prevalent and so feared and so spoken about. And it really strikes me that there was just so much confusion and fear, and as I was saying, desperation, that people were just really stuck in the middle, and in some ways the only thing they could find to do was to try and tell their stories. The first short story in this collection, I just wanted to read a little bit from, because this completely broke me when I first read it. Again, this was something I found in a charity shop back when I was at uni a very long time ago. And I think it's really worth hearing about how these things are described. So this is a short story called Slim, and this is just a little bit from the first page. I don't use that word. I've heard it enough. So I've taken it out of circulation, just here, just at home. I say slim instead, and Buddy understands. I have got slim. When Buddy pays a visit, I have to remind myself not to offer him a cushion. Most people don't need cushions. They're just naturally covered. So I keep all the cushions to myself, now that I've lost my upholstery. Slim is what they call it in Uganda, and it's a perfectly sensible name. You lose more weight than you thought was possible. You lose more weight than you could carry, not that you feel like carrying anything. So I'll say to Buddy on one of his visits, did you see the local news? There was an item about newt conservation, and then there was an item about funding slim research. But newts first. What's it like talking to someone who's outranked by a newt? And for me, when I read this way back, it broke me, because just the idea of how little importance was given to people's lives when, you know, people were dying left, right and center from HIV or from AIDS, and just the lack of care that was given. You know, as I mentioned, Nixon refused to say the word, and that was a thing throughout his whole presidency. Many people did not want to refer to its name anymore, and we see there referring to it as slim, as kind of finding any euphemism you can just to stop using the word. I think the whole thing about slim and him losing his upholstery, losing more weight than he thought he could ever carry, that breaks me. That I find really hard to imagine. And I remember when I was part of an LGBT youth centre when I was a teenager, we at one point went to a centre which used to basically be a bit of a convalescent home for people who were dying of AIDS. And so it was the place where Princess Diana famously you know, held the hand of someone with HIV, and that was seen as a big step at the time. And that, I think, is really telling to just the lives we lost along the way, the power of that discrimination that affected so many people, to really push them down and see their lives as not worth living or not worth the effort. It was only really in many ways once HIV started spreading a little bit more amongst sort of the heterosexual population, particularly in North America, that it started to be seen as more of a public health concern. And that's terrifying, because actually for a while it basically was seen as, oh, well, you know, those queer people, they'll just kind of catch it, spread it amongst themselves and die, and that's a good thing. And it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. So I think it's really powerful when you have works like that, like The Darker Proof, to really speak about what it was like for many people. Just move my camera because there was a lot of glare from the sun just then. The final book I really want to talk about is a fantastic play called The Inheritance by Matthew Lopez. It's set in New York about 30 years after the HIV and AIDS crisis in the US. It follows a group of mostly gay men in New York as they interact with their lives. And it really starts detailing again about what it looks like to be a marginalized person and what some of those effects can be. So for example, HIV and AIDS are discussed, and we see a character who is an older man who basically watched loads of his friends die, including some of his lovers. And he lives with such fear around sex and about being intimate with anybody that it's had a massive effect on his life and his ability to sort of do his day-to-day. What I think is also really powerful about it is where it's set. So it's set just before the Trump presidency, when all of the characters in this play are convinced that Hillary is about to win, and as a result, they've got nothing to worry about. You know, they're modern gay men. Life is getting better and better with each year. You know, there are more challenges to unfair rules or to some of the discrimination that they've been facing. And it does it in such a powerful way because obviously we as the author have that sense of us as the audience have that sense of dramatic irony where we know what comes next. And I think the play is incredibly powerful at looking at just how far we've come. So actually there's a character who goes to a sauna one night and has sex with lots and lots of men without a condom. And he does it in some ways to feel free and liberated, but he's immediately aware of the risk that he's put himself under. And he gets PEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis, which essentially, if taken within 72 hours of being at risk of transmission of HIV, will stop the virus from spreading within your body. And so he essentially has a brush with death, as he sees it, of having been so close to contracting HIV, but then being saved by modern medicine. And that gives him some sort of perspective on his sort of future life going forward. But what's really powerful about that is how this part of that part of the play could not have happened 30 years ago. If we were talking about a character having contact with somebody who was HIV positive, that is incredibly different. You know, back then that would have been somebody contracting HIV, not being able to receive the medical support that they needed, not being able to receive the medication that they needed, and you know, potentially then developing AIDS and potentially dying. And it's so powerful to see how much things have changed, but also how, you know, with the kind of dawning of a Trump presidency, there was still so much fear about how we might go backwards, about how all of these hard-won protections and equalities under the law have come at the cost of a lot of personal sacrifice from so many people, and how all it could really take is a Trump presidency or someone like him to send us back. Thankfully, I'm saying this from 2020, where Trump has just been defeated in an election, but still that terror remains. These steps we often think of as being really positive forward marches towards progress are not guaranteed. They come at the expense of many people's lives, livelihoods, energies, money and time, and it can just as easily go backwards. So we need to stay vigilant. That seems like a dark place to end this, but I think it's an incredibly empowering one to not only think about how far we've come, but also to think about just what can be achieved and what it is that we need to stay focused on as things go forward. I've been Bob, talking about these. Please do leave any comments with any suggestions you have for other great resources or books that talk about HIV and AIDS, or about the AIDS crisis of the 80s. Please do let me know, and I hope this has been useful somewhat for you. I'll leave some resources down in the description box as well, in terms of HIV, AIDS, and protecting yourself. All right, thank you very much, and take care. Bye-bye.